Never told my son about the storage unit on the edge of our property. It had been there since before he was born. A squat, cinder block building at the back of the woodlot, maybe 40 feet from where the tree line starts. His mother and I used to call it the Annex. A private joke between us. She would say, if the house ever burns down, we still have the Annex. And then she would laugh that quiet laugh of hers that never quite reached volume, but always reached my chest. She died 11 years ago now. Pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to the last morning. I held her hand in the palliative ward at St. Michael's in Toronto. 6 weeks is not enough time to say anything that matters. I know that now. You think you will have more time, and then suddenly the nurse is dimming the lights, and you are driving home alone on the 4 run at 2 in the morning, and the radio is playing something you will never be able to listen to again. Her name was Dorothy. Everyone called her Dot. After she went, I kept myself together the way men of my generation were taught to keep themselves together, by working. I ran a clock repair shop on Queen Street West for 31 years. Small place, the kind that smells of machine oil and old wood. I learned the trade from my own father in Sudbury, and I passed through it the way you pass through most things in life, not always understanding the value until much later. When Dorothy was alive, the shop was something I came home from. After she died, it became the place I went to. Not think, my son. I will call him by the name he has always been to me, which is simply my boy, though he is 41 years old now, and I doubt he would appreciate the sentiment. His name is Nolan. Nolan James Calloway. He grew up in the East End, went to Ryerson, studied business, married a woman named Petra when he was 34. I liked Petra well enough at first. She was organized, she remembered birthdays, she had strong opinions about kitchen renovations. But there is always a but, isn't there? I am 68 years old, and I have learned that when a man starts a sentence with "she was organized," the word "but" is always about 4 syllables behind. Petra grew up in Mississauga, in a family that measured love in square footage. That is the kindest way I know to put it. The first time she visited my house in Leslieville, she walked through the front room, looked at the built-in bookshelves Dorothy and I had spent 2 weekends sanding and painting, and said, "Cozy." She said it the way people say unusual when they mean I don't understand this, and I'm not sure I want to. I noticed, but I said nothing. That was my mistake. Not the first, not the last. For the first few years of their marriage, things were fine. Nolan came around for dinner on Sundays. We watched hockey. We talked about the shop. He still had the curiosity he had as a boy, asking me how a certain movement worked, picking up a pocket watch from the workbench and turning it over in his hands. Those Sunday evenings were the thing I looked forward to most in the week. Then gradually, they stopped. Not all at once. It was the way a clock winds down, imperceptibly, and then suddenly you notice the hands have not moved in some time. First, it was every other Sunday, then once a month, then the calls came instead of the visits, and the calls got shorter, and at some point I realized I was the one always calling first. I told myself it was just life. He was busy. She kept a full schedule. They had renovations underway, or a trip planned, or something. But then the questions started. The first one came at Christmas, maybe 4 years into their marriage. We were sitting after dinner, Petra and Nolan, across from me at my own kitchen table, and she said, almost casually, "So have you thought at all about the shop? What you might do with it eventually?" I told her I planned to keep running it for as long as my hands were steady. She smiled. She said, of course. And then she said, "It's just that Queen Street property values have gone quite a bit, haven't they? Do you have a current appraisal?" I said I didn't see the need. She said it might be useful for planning purposes. I looked at Nolan. He was looking at his dessert plate. I said I'd think about it. I didn't think about it, but I did start thinking about other things. Over the next 2 years, I began noticing a pattern. Every visit, which by now was maybe once every 6 weeks, would find its way, eventually, to the subject of money. Not crudely. Petra was not crude. She was systematic. She would ask about my retirement savings, framed as concern. She would ask about the mortgage, framed as curiosity. She would ask whether I had updated my will recently, framed as responsibility. "You really should have a proper estate plan, Dad," she said once, using a word. Dad that sat wrong in my mouth even hearing it. I told her I had things in order. She asked if she and Nolan were listed as beneficiaries. I said things were in order. That night, after they left, I sat in the kitchen for a long time. Dorothy's photograph is on the windowsill above the sink, the one from our trip to Prince Edward Island, the summer before she got sick, her hair blowing sideways, laughing at something just out of the frame. I looked at that photograph for a while. Then I went out to the annex. I have not told anyone what is in the annex. Not Nolan. Not my lawyer. Though she suspects, I think, from the nature of some of my questions over the years. Not my old friend Reginald, who has known me since we were both apprenticing in Sudbury in our 20s, and who would probably say something wry and Canadian about it all. What is in the annex is this: 41 years of repairs, restorations, and, in the later decades, purchases. I'm not a wealthy man, in the way the word is usually meant. I don't have a portfolio. I don't have investments. What I have is clocks. Specifically, I have a collection of antique and vintage timepieces that I have been quietly acquiring since before Nolan was born. Pocket watches, mantel clocks, a long case clock that I restored entirely by hand over 3 winters, several early Canadian railroad watches, a small number of pieces that came from estates. I kept records of everything. I had several pieces appraised privately through contacts I trust in 2019. The total appraised value was just under $340,000. I had never shown that number to anyone. The clocks lived in climate-controlled cabinets in the annex, which from the outside looks like nothing more than a garden shed with a padlock. Which, as far as Nolan and Petra knew, was exactly what it was. I want to be clear about something. I am not a suspicious man by nature. I am not dramatic. I come from a family of quiet people who fix things with their hands and didn't make a great deal of noise about their inner lives. If Petra had simply been a woman who talked about money more than I was comfortable with, I would have adjusted and moved on. But in the spring of last year, something happened that I cannot explain away. I had been at the shop late on a Thursday, a grandfather clock for a client in Rosedale, the kind of job that requires patience and a good light, and I came home after dark to find a car parked on the gravel lane that runs alongside the property. A grey Hyundai I didn't recognize. The front of my house was dark, which is normal, but the light in the annex was on. The light in the annex has no business being on when I am not home. I sat in my truck for a moment. Then I went in through the front door, moved quietly through the house, and looked out the back window. The annex door was open. There were 2 figures inside. I have a camera in the annex. I installed it 3 years ago after a break-in a few streets over. It feeds to my phone. I sat down at the kitchen table, pulled up the app, and watched. One of the figures was Nolan. The other was a man I didn't know, younger, maybe mid-30s, wearing a jacket with a real estate brokerage logo on the chest. He was moving slowly through the room, looking at the cabinets. He picked up a piece, a French carriage clock, one of my finest, and turned it over. Nolan was talking. I couldn't hear through the app, but I could see him gesturing, explaining something, the way he used to explain things when he was 12 years old and had gotten himself into something. The real estate man was nodding. They were in there for 22 minutes. Then they left, turned off the light, and pulled the door closed, but did not lock it. I heard the grey Hyundai back down the lane. I sat at my kitchen table until midnight. The question that sat with me was not, how did he get in? I keep a spare key in a lockbox on the back porch, which he has known about since his mother died. The question was, why? Why was my son showing a real estate man through a building on my property without asking me, without telling me, without even calling to say he was coming? The next morning I called Reginald. He is a careful man, Reginald. He thinks before he speaks, which is a quality I have always admired. I told him what I had seen. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Call Karen. Karen is my lawyer. Karen Whitfield, with an office on Bay Street, who handled Dorothy's estate and who has known me for 15 years. I called her that afternoon. She did not seem surprised. That was perhaps the most unsettling part. She said, "Given what you've told me, I think we should update the documentation and also have a conversation about your options." She said it calmly, efficiently, the way she says most things. I said I wasn't ready to change the will yet. She said, "That's your decision. But let's make sure everything is formalized and protected." And I'd suggest a private appraisal on record, with my office holding the copies. I told her about the appraisal I'd had done in 2019. She said she wanted updated ones. She also said, "If you're concerned about access to the property, you should change the lockbox combination." I did that the same afternoon. Over the following weeks, I paid attention. I started keeping a kind of mental log, not suspicious by instinct, but careful in the way that a man who works with small mechanisms learns to be careful, because small things, misaligned, cause large failures over time. Nolan called more frequently, which should have been a relief, but the calls had a quality to them I had not noticed before, a practiced warmth, questions asked twice, an eagerness that felt under examination, like preparation, rather than genuine feeling. Petra called once, which was unusual, and spent most of the conversation on property taxes and the seniors rebate program in Ontario, which she said she'd been looking into just for my benefit. I thanked her. I said nothing else. Karen had the new appraisals completed by August. The revised value was $387,000, which she attributed to rising interest in Canadian horological pieces specifically. She registered the full inventory with her office. She told me quietly, at the end of our meeting, that whatever I decided about the will, the collection was now properly documented as an estate asset. I drove home that day through the streets of the East End, past the old neighborhoods, past the shop with its small hand-painted sign, and I thought about Dorothy. I thought about the way she used to sit in the back of the shop on slow afternoons and wind the display clocks one by one, just to keep herself busy. I thought about the fact that Nolan had spent a great deal of his childhood in that shop, and that somewhere between childhood and 41 years old and Petra, something had shifted in a direction I didn't fully understand. I want to be fair to him. I need to say that clearly. I am not a man who believes his children owe him devotion. Dorothy and I raised him to be independent. We celebrated his independence when it came. What I did not expect, what no parent expects, is to one day be sitting at your own kitchen table watching a camera feed and feeling the particular cold of discovering that someone you love has been measuring the distance between your heartbeat and your inheritance. In September, Nolan called and asked if he could come for dinner. Just him, he said. He wanted to talk. I said yes. He arrived on a Saturday evening with a bottle of wine, a Niagara Riesling, the kind his mother used to like. I made the pot roast Dorothy taught me, the one with the parsnips and the Worcestershire, and we sat across from each other at the kitchen table the way we used to on Sundays before the visits tapered off. He was nervous. I could see it in his hands, the way he turned the wineglass without drinking from it. He looked like he had practiced what he was going to say. He talked about their finances first. He and Petra had overextended, he said. The renovations had gone over budget, well over, significantly over. The line of credit was higher than he was comfortable with. He was not in a position to ask for help, he said, but he wanted me to know. I listened. I said, "I'm glad you told me." He then said, carefully, that he had been thinking about the future, about planning, by the fact that I had a lot of assets that were not, his word, liquid. He said he'd had a conversation with someone in real estate who thought the shop building alone was worth a considerable amount. He said maybe it was worth discussing options. I put down my fork. I said, "When were you in the Annex, Nolan?" He stopped. I waited. He said, "A few months ago." I should have asked. I know I should have asked. I said, "You brought someone." He said, I thought if I had numbers, if I had something concrete, it would be easier to have the conversation." I said, "What conversation?" He looked at his plate. He said, "I just wanted to understand what was there, what everything was worth. I wasn't going to do anything without you." I said, "That man with the real estate logo on his jacket, who is he to you?" He said, "He was a contact, a friend of Petra's brother." I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "Nolan, I have watched you your whole life. I know what you like when you're telling me everything, and I know what you look like when you're telling me everything, and I know what you look like right now." He put his head in his hands, and then he said something I was not expecting. He said, I know, Dad. She kept saying it was the responsible thing. She kept saying you'd never touch it, that it was just sitting there, that it made sense to plan around it. And I let her. I kept letting her, and I don't know when I stopped thinking for myself. I sat with that for a while. Outside, a streetcar went by on Queen. Inside, the long case clock in the hallway, the one I restored over 3 winters, the one his mother used to set her watch by, ticked steadily in the silence. I told him that I had updated my documents. I told him that Karen had everything on file, formally, including the collection in the Annex, which I then described to him for the first time, the full inventory, the current appraised value, the history of every piece. I watched his face as I talked. He had not known the extent of it, that was clear. I said, your mother and I built all of this carefully, over a long time, because we believed in being careful. I have not been hiding it from you to be cruel. I have been keeping it because the things that last are the things that are kept well. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, I owe you an apology that I don't know how to make right yet. I said, I know. I said, I'm not going to pretend this didn't happen. And I'm not going to tell you it's fine, because it isn't fine. And you're old enough to sit with that. I said, but I also know who you are. I've known you since you were 3 hours old, and you grabbed my finger in the hospital and held on. I know who you are underneath all of this. He looked up. I said, Petra is a separate matter, and I won't tell you what to do there. That's yours, but you and I, we are going to find our way back to Sunday dinners, and I am going to teach you how to service a pocket watch properly, which I should have done years ago, and we are going to start again from somewhere honest. Do you understand me? He said yes. We sat at the table another 2 hours, drinking the Riesling slowly, talking the way we used to, about small things, about the shop, about a repair that had given me trouble all week. He asked about the long case clock, how I'd sourced the movement. He asked questions the way he used to as a boy. Before he left, he stood in the hallway for a moment. He looked at his mother's photograph on the windowsill. He said, I think she would have told me to get my head straight a lot sooner than you did. I said, she would have been considerably less polite about it. He laughed, a real laugh, the kind that has weight to it. After he drove away, I locked up the shop, walked out through the backyard, and stood for a moment at the door of the Annex. The air had that particular smell of early October in Toronto, leaves and cold pavement, and wood smoke from somewhere up the street. I unlocked the door and turned on the light and stood among the cabinets for a while, the way I sometimes do when I need to think. The clocks ticked, not in unison, never in unison, because no 2 movements are exactly the same, but together the way a family moves through time, each one keeping its own pace and somehow collectively not falling too far behind. I thought about Dorothy. I thought about what she would have said, and I thought she probably would have said, you waited long enough, didn't you? She would have been right. She was usually right. I turned off the light, locked the door, and went back inside to wash the dishes. I think about the long case clock in the hallway sometimes. The one I restored over 3 winters. The one Dorothy used to set her watch by. It did not become what it is because someone rushed it. It became what it is because I was patient with it, and honest about what it needed, and willing to sit with the difficult parts until I understood them. That is the only way I know how to do anything. What happened with Nolan did not come from nowhere. That is the thing I've had to reckon with, sitting alone in the kitchen after he drove away that October night. The choices that led to that grey Hyundai on my gravel lane, to a real estate man turning my carriage clock over in his hands. Those choices did not happen in a single moment. They accumulated, quietly, the way debt accumulates, the way a movement falls out of alignment. A small silence here, an unanswered question there, a father who kept his counsel too long, and a son who slowly stopped trusting his own. I am not exempt from that accounting. I want to be clear about that. A man who fixes things for a living should know better than anyone that neglect is its own kind of damage. I kept the Annex locked and said nothing about it for 40 years, and I told myself that was prudence. Maybe some of it was, But some of it was also just the habit of men from my part of the world, from my generation, the habit of keeping your worth to yourself, as if sharing it might diminish it somehow. Dorothy would have told me otherwise. She was always better at the open door than I was. What I've come to understand is this: the values you carry, the ones about honesty, about doing right by people, about building something that lasts, they do not transmit by themselves. You have to be present for that. You have to show up, literally and repeatedly, and let the person you love see you living by those values in ordinary moments. Not just the serious ones, the ordinary ones. A Sunday dinner, a pocket watch disassembled on the workbench, a quiet hour in a shop that smells of oil and old wood. Nolan lost his footing for a while. I understand that now without excusing it. When the person you have built a life alongside starts shaping how you see the world, and that shaping goes unchallenged long enough, the ground shifts under you in ways you stop noticing. The strength to recognize that, to say out loud, "I stopped thinking for myself," that took something real from him. It took more courage than I gave him credit for when he first said it. And that is the other thing I have been turning over. Strength is not the absence of going wrong. Strength is what you do once you know you have. It is sitting across the table from your father and not flinching from the weight of his silence. It is not asking to be let off the hook, but asking, instead, to start again from somewhere honest. We are doing that now. Slowly, the way good repairs go. Last Sunday, he sat at my workbench for 2 hours while I walked him through a Hamilton Railroad watch, movement piece by piece. He asked good questions. He always did, when he let himself. Dorothy would have enjoyed watching that. I set down the clock, turned off the bench light, and went to put the kettle on.